Trade associations in the United States are calling on their government to fight back against Canada's new digital services tax. The tax plans to add a 3% levy on foreign tech giants that generate revenue from Canadian users. But it's not just those in the U.S. that are upset with this new tax. The Ford government is also pushing back. Ontario Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy wrote to his federal counterpart last week. Now is not the time for Canada to put a target on its back. Unilaterally implementing this tax not only imposes new costs on our economy, it could significantly harm our relationship with the United States. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland responded to those concerns today.
We have specifically been working very hard and very collaboratively with the U.S., and I am confident that a win-win outcome, a negotiated win-win outcome for Canada and the U.S. is absolutely possible.
Matthew Holmes is the Senior Vice President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and he joins me now. Matthew Holmes, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Good to see
you. You've been calling on the government not to go ahead with this. Now you think they should reverse the implementation of the digital services tax. I mean, how is this going to affect Canadian companies?
Well, part of the problem is we don't know how it will affect Canadian companies. There's the business that other companies do here in Canada, but there's also a lot of Canadian companies that could be captured within the net of this new digital services tax. And there could be further retaliation against Canadian companies that export to the US and other markets.
The tax seems to be designed, though, to capture large global multinational companies that you need to have more than $1 billion in global revenues, and 20 million of that, anything in excess of $20 million in revenue in Canada is taxed at 3%. So isn't this precise enough that it's only going to hit the big digital giants?
Well, it's certainly targeting big digital giants, but it could actually affect many others. So loyalty programs within Canada, Canadians love their travel loyalty points. Those could be impacted. Our travel sites that we use quite frequently, those could fall within the thresholds that have been identified here. And further, it invites retaliatory action from the United States. It seems provocative, particularly doing this right before July 4th. And there have been strong concerns raised by U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Catherine Tai. Ambassador David Cohen here in Ottawa has also raised concerns, and we just see this as a provocation at a very sensitive time with the U.S.
But, you know, the U.S. has kind of been seen as holding this up, right? Because Canada wanted to do the global deal on this through the OECD and through other G7 mechanisms. And it never got there, and a lot of it has been resistance in the U.S. and the U.S. Congress. So can a country like Canada just wait for the U.S.'s approval on something like this when the UK, France, and Italy and others have already gone ahead?
Well, many other countries are waiting. They're working together at that multilateral table at the OECD. Canada has always been a country that really prides itself in following the rule of law and working at that multi-jurisdictional level. And so it seems strange and surprising that Canada would choose to move unilaterally like this, particularly with that sensitive and very, very special relationship we have with the United States.
Is it unilateral, though, when the UK has done it, France has done it, Italy has done it? I mean, other G7 partners have moved in this direction, and they're not facing trade retaliation of any consequence, it seems.
Sure, some of them moved, and it was before some of that OECD pillar conversation was taking place. So there was already those early movers. France is a good example. What we saw in France, they put this tax in place that immediately was pushed on to consumers. So this will be inflationary. Canadian consumers will see prices go up, in our opinion. And they also invited retaliation from the U.S. or the threat of retaliation from the U.S.
So how do you reconcile this, though? Because these companies do business in Canada, but because they're situated elsewhere, a lot of their activities, which are quite lucrative and quite profitable, they're shielded from a lot of tax. I mean, is it just the way this is being done, or is it the very idea of a digital services tax that you have discomfort with?
No, I think that's a valid conversation taking place around a digital services tax, and how is that done in a global and a consistent way. And I think that's exactly the conversation that's supposed to be happening at the OECD table, and that the countries at that table have agreed to extend the timeline on. Canada has stepped out of that process and said, no, we're going to move alone. We're going to use this as either a pressure tactic or we're just doing it outright. The other concern we have, though, which is a very specific one on this, is the tax is retroactive. So imagine, David, you've followed the law, you've paid your taxes, and then suddenly you're told, oh no, there's a new tax, and you owe it 3 years retroactively. You owe back taxes for something that didn't exist beforehand. And that's a concern for us from the business perspective. It creates uncertainty, and that affects investment in Canada. It affects the environment to attract investment in Canada.
It's retroactive, but retroactive to a point where these big companies would have been told this was coming, right? Like it goes back to about 2022, and the government has been signaling for a number of years it was moving in this direction. So if you're Amazon or Google or Facebook, you would have seen this coming and perhaps already baked it into your planning, would you not?
Well, again, companies have to follow the rule of the land in which they do business at that time, and they're accountable to their shareholders as well. So the government says a lot of things. It says it wants to do a lot of things. Many of them aren't done, or it reverses on those things. And so I don't think you can really run a business today based on signals or press releases or even just something a minister says in a press scrum. You have to actually base it on what are the rules of the land. And this new law, or this new tax, is being put in place 3 years retroactively.
So it's coming in, as you say, primarily, let's be blunt, it primarily targets big American tech companies. I mean, that's really who people are talking about here. And as you say, it comes in right before the July 4th holiday, but also in the middle of a pretty intense presidential election cycle and on-cycle Senate and congressional elections. I mean, what are your concerns in terms of the political fallout from a move like this, given the intensity of what's happening in the United States right now?
Well, we feel it's provocative. We feel that the signals have been sent by our most important trade relationship, or our trade partner, that they have concerns about us moving in this way. It sends the signal that we're more willing to take, the $1.4 billion a year that this represents for the Canadian coffers and jeopardize the trade relationship, which currently is about $600 billion a year in exports to the United States. So we're chasing literally 2 pennies on every dollar that we're currently selling down to the U.S.
Right, but it is $1.4 billion, right? It is money that Canada feels it's entitled to because of the economic activity happening inside its borders, and the OECD process, while Canada still says it's committed to that, it's going slow, and it keeps going slow and keeps pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off. And that's all just reprieve for these companies who get to keep making money without paying the tax, right? So Canada has at some point to act.
Well, we're looking at that. I mean, look, you could have everybody around the world, all of the jurisdictions put in place their own little taxes, and the system quickly breaks down. What we would like to see is a consistent and coherent approach to this being taken. The other thing to keep in mind is these companies are putting a lot of money into the ecosystem here. They're supporting creators and artisans through marketplaces. They're putting money into Canadian content. They're putting money into journalism. Many of these same companies are facing multiple new taxes. They've contributed to HST or GST. There's all kinds of other things. So we're not arguing against a tax per se. We're talking about process here and about how provocative Canada really wants to be at such a sensitive time with the U.S. relationship.
Well, it seems, though, I mean, the order in council has been posted, the tax has been implemented, and we heard from the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, today, and it sounds like they're quite content with this decision. So, absent big retaliation from the United States, which is often threatened but doesn't always happen, what do you think the federal government's going to do about your concerns here?
Well, I think it's what Canadians do with this. We're going to see prices go up in a time of inflation. We're going to see businesses potentially face retaliation in terms of our export relationship with the U.S. And of course, as we have potentially a new administration coming into the U.S., we're going to be facing or setting a tone in 2025 that is right before the review of our most important trade relationship, our trade agreement with CUSMA. And so that tone that we're setting could really compromise the ability for us to have a good faith and goodwill negotiation across the table or a review with our trading partners.
Matthew Holmes, Senior Vice President with the Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for your time today, sir.
Thank you, David.
Some business groups are calling on the federal government to reverse a controversial digital services tax. The 3% tax will apply to foreign tech giants that generate revenue from Canadian users. It's a move the government says means more tax fairness, but has some Canadian business associations crying foul.
This will be inflationary. Canadian consumers will see prices go up, in our opinion, and there could be further retaliation against Canadian companies that export to the U.S. and other markets.
In the current situation, Canada is worse off from some of our allies who are not facing any retaliation. That's just not fair. It's just not okay for Canada and Canadians. It's not in the national interest.
The U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, released a statement on the 4th of July saying the U.S. Trade Representative has noted its concerns with Canada's digital services tax and is assessing and is open to using all available tools that could result in meaningful progress toward addressing unilateral discriminatory digital services taxes. So will Canadians pay a price for going it alone on this tax? The Power Panel is with me. Cameron Ahmad, Zane Belge, James Moore, and Tonda McCharles. So Cameron, Christopher Freeland would argue they're not going it alone, right? The UK, France, Italy have digital services taxes without retaliation. The trade relationship, though, between Canada and the US, a little bit more substantial than those countries. They're going ahead with it. She says it's about fairness. What do you think of the play?
Well, I think she has a strong winning argument on her side, and it sounds like we're losing out right now, especially if other countries have already imposed a tax on, let's remember, some of the biggest, most profitable multinational corporations in the world who operate in Canada, as you noted in your interview with the Chamber rep earlier, who don't pay the share of taxes that they should be paying. And I think this is a winning argument for the government if they get ahead of it. Something that struggle to do sometimes is allow other people to own the narrative here. I think it's really important to come forward with a really clear, strong argument, say we're on the side of Canadians, we're on the side of working people. These are massively profitable, huge corporations who should be paying taxes just like they do in other countries. We don't represent the United States or their business interests, we represent you, and this is something that's legitimate.
But what if it leads to higher costs on things like your digital services like it has in France, for example?
That's an argument for any tax, right? I think it's pretty intuitive for people to understand that these huge companies like Amazon or Meta are already making enormous amounts of money, and they should be contributing to the country that they work in.
So Tonda, the argument has been that, at least from Christopher Freeland today, is that we were losing out as a country. It's about fairness that they pay. And they have been signaling this for years and talking about it, but then always sort of like demurring when asked, when are you going to implement it? And then, lo and behold, an order in council just gets published and there's no announcement. It's just a press conference. It's just there. You know, what do you make of the way this was brought into force? It's strange.
Well, to Cameron's point, there hasn't been a strong argument to boost support for this kind of a change. And it's no surprise that the Ontario Finance Minister, representing a government that is in favor of cutting taxes, would argue against such a thing. But the Canadian government, hasn't made its case very publicly very well. And even, I've read some stuff that some experts have written about this particular plan, and they too are baffled by some things. Look, it's not just going to hit big American multinationals. Potentially it could also hit Canadian digital services companies, although some of that is even unclear. But Shopify, Loblaws, and Canadian Tire and Hudson's Bay, who offer online marketing services as well, could they be hit? How do you justify that? Well, one way the government might be justifying it is that, what they might take in a digital services tax could pay for about a year of dental care. They don't talk about things in concrete, understandable terms to make their case. But I think that to say simply that, other countries do it, also doesn't give Canadians the benefit of having the information that Canada's doing it differently. Our tax, the proposed tax, is broader. It's going to cover potentially more companies, and takes a whole different tack. It's higher than the tax that France imposed. And even in that case, the U.S. did threaten retaliation against France. So also not to be underestimated is there is a very real threat coming now from a Democratic administration, but nobody should fool themselves that Trump wouldn't absolutely go full in.
Right.
And levy perhaps 100% tariff on some certain Canadian imports. That's a real threat.
But Zane, there is a consensus across a lot of countries that these companies do need to face some sort of consistent application of taxation because they do commerce in countries, but they're based in other countries, so there's a lot of tax avoidance there because of that setup. They'd been working, Canada had, with the G7 and the OECD for years, but it kept getting held up, and America was a big part of it. How long do they wait? Do you think they can sell this? Do you think they're at risk for doing this?
They could be at risk, and I don't love the Christopher Freeland argument, because while I agree with Cameron that the facts are on her side, the message here is kind of weak. To say that other jurisdictions have done this and not face penalty, to me that simplifies as we're going to tax them because other jurisdictions have, and we're going to get away with it because they have. And I feel like, that is logically cogent. That's probably a good internal bureaucratic argument. But to Tonda's point, this should have been a coalition building exercise for the Liberals. Big tech should have been the focus here, not the taxation instrument. And it should have been a conversation on big tech and their impacts to communities, positive and negative, but they should have been the square-on enemy here if they wanted to frame it in those militaristic terms. And it should have been about what do you get as a result of it. Instead, we're talking about a tax. We're not talking about what a tax will oxygenate for us as a society. Tanya brings up dental care. They could even have micro-targeted even further to say this is what it could mean for your community, what it could mean for certain jurisdictions. This is how you build coalitions, and this is how you try to sell something that should have been, frankly, a open net goal, because big tech, if you look down in the United States, is one of the few I was going to say nonpartisan, but one of the few multi-partisan issues that Democrats and Republicans have gotten in line with. And we had a chance here to do that. But instead, we're talking about the tax, not who it's waged against and not what it can benefit Canadians. And I think that was a huge miss on the messaging here. And I think we're going to pay for it for that reason, not the fact that we're stepping ahead in front of an OECD brokered deal, which is still potentially on the rails.
So James, it's not surprising to see the business community pushing back against the idea of any kind of an increased tax, but we all are also seeing it from the U.S. Trade Representative. There's concerns of this being done in a contentious election cycle and with the NAFTA soon up for review, the NAFTA agreement. You were on the NAFTA Council last time. I mean, what are your thoughts on the potential risk there?
Well, to me, that's the most important lens of all this. You can put any of these lenses we put on it and analyze from that. But I think in the macro, look, I think as a parliamentary budget officer assessed that this tax at its peak would bring in about $1.5 to $1.7 billion in revenue per year into the government of Canada. Big number. A bigger number is $2.5 billion, which is the amount of two-way trade that happens between Canada and the United States every single day. So the relationship between Canada and the U.S., well, we can pick singular fights on particular issues, whether it's supply management or intellectual property or tariff access on certain goods and so on. The macro relationship is enormously important. The protectionist movement in the United States is bipartisan. It exists in both parties in the form of Donald Trump. It has jingoistic and racial elements relative to Mexico. It's got, promising tariffs on automobiles coming from China, which would then bleed into Canada. He's put tariffs in Canada before. With Joe Biden, it comes in the form of their anti-inflation measures, which were enormously damaging to Canada and our ability to access opportunities in the United States. So here we are sort of picking a fight over $1.7 billion when we have a $2.5 billion per day relationship with the United States that's going to be renegotiated in the next 24 months. So, I mean, you talk about dimes holding up dollars and risking a macro relationship for a pretty petty fight about, going after global tech giants. Look, the Canada-U.S. relationship is not the same as the Italy-U.S. relationship. It's not the same as the Netherlands or the Paraguay-U.S. relationship, which is what Minister Freeland has compared us to. It's much bigger, much more important, and should be dealt with much more strategically.
But James, on that macro argument you're making, if it really is $1.5 to $1.7 billion, that micro number compared to the daily trade, is it really big enough to be that big of an irritant, I guess is my question.
Apparently so. The USTR, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, ambassadors, current and former, have all flagged this. And it's not just U.S. big business. You just had on your show the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, by the way, is a confederation of all the small chambers of commerce all across this country. They're not big business. They're not. It's the small businesses across the country through the chamber have come together and said, don't do this. It hurts us too. So listen to Canadian business, not American business, while you're doing your assessment, is my message to Minister Freeland.
Cameron, what's your thoughts on that?
I think James makes some very strong points, but I would remind everyone that this government is no stranger to dealing with two administrations, Democratic and Republican, and very serious threats to both our trading relationship and tariffs, many other things that they've put in front of us, and has managed to navigate it better than almost any other country in the world and come out in a pretty good situation. So I think that they are well equipped to do that again. And to Zane's point and Tanda's point on the messaging, I think they're absolutely right. I mean, this is a winning argument for the vast majority of people to say big corporations should be paying their fair share, and here is what you get out of it. Here are all the important programs we need the revenue to pay for. This is going to make a difference in your lives when these massive companies can absolutely afford to pay a little bit more when they operate in our country.
Tanda, we've got about a minute left. Last word to you, because you're my hometown. And your hometown.
And, you know, I do wonder what impact this will have on overall sort of the tech innovation sector in this country too, right? Like it layers on another cost of doing business for them. Will that be passed on to the users or consumers of any services? Look, that's to be determined, I guess. But the government has also not shown itself to be unafraid of going after tech or digital giants in the past. You know, early on, they weren't so successful in a Netflix streaming tax or whatever it was back in those days. But here we are in a world where they're regulating and taxing, and you know, big tech and digital giants, and also trying to regulate content on those platforms as well. So I think they're unafraid of those battles. I just, though, to James's point, I think I would be wary about picking which battles you fight right now, especially if there's a multilateral international effort to coordinate a taxation approach.
Okay, we got to leave it there. I want to thank you all, even James, who said I was full of it with the first topic we were talking about here. I appreciate it.
Not you, just the topic.
All right, thanks to the Power Bell. Tana McCharles, James Moore, Zane Velji, and Cameron Ahmad.